I think especially if you come from a country like New Zealand, where we have a really strong breast is best policy, that is the public health message. When you do have struggles with supply, you can feel quite alone, quite isolated in that, quite a failure, that you're really unusual because you haven't been able to supply, and that the worst case scenario would be that you have to use formula. It's seen as this absolute failing almost, that you would have to resort to formula. I think that it's if you can breastfeed your baby, that is awesome, and that's a great milk supply for them, but cost-effective way and be really convenient, but also for a lot of people it does not work for them. And actually at the end of the day, fed is best. Hello and welcome to PCOS Explained, formerly the PCOS Nutritionist podcast. I'm your host, Clare Goodwin, a registered nutritionist and exercise scientist, specialising in PCOS because I have it too. Each week, we'll uncover the latest research, share inspiring stories, and provide practical tips to help you thrive with PCOS. Whether you're newly diagnosed, you've been struggling with this for a long time, or supporting someone with PCOS, this podcast is your go-to resource for empowerment, education, and community. So join us as we uncover the tools to thrive with PCOS. PCOS Explained is brought to you by our very own service, Ovie. Ovie is your go-to health service for women with PCOS. We help you improve your PCOS symptoms and prevent the long-term complications of PCOS by giving you hyper-personalised health advice based on your specific symptoms and PCOS drivers. We have a range of plans to suit your needs, from a DIY app-based program to one-on-one consultations. You choose what suits your budget and learning preference. And we offer a result-based guarantee on our Premium Plus plan, meaning that if we don't help you achieve your goal, we refund your money. Ovie is available worldwide, so it doesn't matter whether you're based in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else, we can still help you.
Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. This is Emma here, interviewing Clare today. So, hi Clare, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you.
Good. So today we're going to be talking about breastfeeding, but in PCOS and what that sort of looks like. So I'm yet to breastfeed, yet to have a baby, but Clare, you've been through this and you have experienced some difficulties with breastfeeding with having PCOS.
Absolutely. And so this is why we thought this was actually a podcast that we first started talking about this back in 2019, so well before I was considering having children, but based on what I was seeing in patients with PCOS, I saw a huge number that said that they were struggling with breast milk supply. So I started looking into this and why might that be happening. So now we're kind of revisiting that with the latest research, my experience, and then also we're going to be doing podcasts looking at lots of different women of PCOS and their experience with it. So good experience and having great breast milk supply, but also the flip side and those that have really struggled with that. So you can hear a huge variety of experiences.
Yeah, which I think is so valuable because everyone's experience is different, but the more you can hear about variations or differences or other people's experiences, the more that can kind of help you feel, draw parallels with your experience, or feel a little bit actually there is no right way for things to go, or no perfect way, and this is it's a spectrum, and I will hopefully fall somewhere in there.
Absolutely. And I think especially if you come from a country like New Zealand, where we have a really strong breast is best policy. That is the public health message. And when you do have struggles with supply, you can feel quite alone, quite isolated in that, quite a failure, and that you're really unusual because you haven't been able to supply, and that the worst case scenario would be that you have to use formula. It's seen as this absolute failing almost, that you would have to resort to formula.
Totally, because it's there's so many other layers to breastfeeding in terms of even just getting the baby to latch, or all the other things, then to think, oh my gosh, my supply is the thing that's now causing the further roadblock. So you can feel you can take on the onus of that quite a lot, and it can feel probably quite isolating and shameful. So
and this is not even just you putting the pressure on yourself. You're literally being told by midwives, and I was told I was on a pumping schedule. I had to pump every hour on the hour for a week to to try and increase supply. It's
I
massively
remember you
taxing.
pumping in the office.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I pumped like 7 months probably.
Yeah.
But this was in the early stages, was like super frequently, because it's still thought of in that community that the only reason that you might have low supply is low demand.
Yeah, low stimulation, exactly. Yeah.
And so therefore, if you can stimulate through pumping, then your demand will catch up. But what they fundamentally misunderstand is that there are so many other factors that can affect demand supply, like, do you even have the breast tissue to create milk? Do you have the hormone profile that allow your body to actually raise those hormones to create that milk? So it's much more complex than just a supply and demand thing. And that's what we're going to be going through today, is a bit about, like, is this something that's common, or was this just my experience? So yeah, a little bit of caveat that, like, this was my experience, so I'm probably a little bit more vocal about this than what other people are, but it is also quite prevalent. And then, okay, what's happening here? Why is it? Is it that I just didn't try hard enough, or which is not the case? What can go wrong, and what are the red flags to look out for during pregnancy, just to be aware that you may have some supply issues.
Yeah, give you a little bit of a heads up.
Yeah.
To think about things. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that was really helpful in my pregnancy, is that I already had a heads up. I could already see some red flags, and so I kind of had those strategies already in place. Whereas, because it's such a huge shock when the baby comes along, and then you don't really know what you're doing, and then you're sleep deprived, and
There's
then
so much else going on in that phase.
such a lot of learning, and you don't know what you're doing because you've never done it before, and you're, as I said, you're sleep deprived, you're not necessarily making the greatest decisions, and then if your baby's not sleeping because they're hungry, then it's going to get worse. And so being able to have this knowledge and, okay, what are the next steps, how do I recognise these, can be a real blessing.
So let's start there. What were some of the red flags that you noticed that kind of gave you, from your already baseline knowledge, that gave you an idea, okay, this could be an issue for me?
The main one was very little breast change during pregnancy. So this is a red flag because the hormones that we produce during pregnancy are supposed to start to stimulate that breast milk supply. And so if you've noticed very little breast change in terms of, like, you haven't had to change bras during whole pregnancy, that may be a red flag that your breast tissue is not developing. And this is something that not many people talk about. Again, it's all that supply and demand thing, but you do have to have that breast milk, like the tissue, in order to. And it's not about having the biggest breasts. Like, actually, a lot of people that have big breasts doesn't necessarily mean, like, good supply or oversupply, but it's got to be the right kind of tissue and the developing in that right way. So.
And it's kind of that, like you say, if depending on where you started to what is growing during pregnancy, that's that tissue that's coming to life essentially from those breast milk producing hormones. So it's not necessarily, like you said, if we start bigger, that automatically means you're going to have good supply. It's the change.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why just noticing this yourself can be a good thing. If you are, like, worried about that, if you think, oh yeah, actually I haven't, then you can even get a breast examination done. They can have a look. I did mention this to my OBGYN, and she was like, yeah, you're right, that is a red flag, and here's the number for a lactation consultant so that you have it on hand if you do need it postpartum, and here's kind of the channel for how to get them, or how to get referred, or how to get it for free. So that was really good. The other thing that can be a red flag is the shape of your breasts. So if you have more wide set breasts, so this is a problem because a lot of that milk producing tissue is actually on the inner side as well, and so just the shape of your breast can determine whether actually you have the tissue in order to produce milk. So in terms of breast shape, you can see what that means. So, like, wide set breasts, tubular shaped breasts, those again are not conducive to good milk supply. So it's all about what they look like, where the breast tissue is developing, and therefore is that going to lead to good breast milk supply.
Yeah, it's
so
interesting.
That was the one thing that I personally noticed. But then there are other things in terms of hormonal profile that I knew. Like, I already knew that I had PCOS and I had insulin resistance, and the androgens and the insulin resistance are two other things. So I kind of already knew that I, like, ticked both those things as well. So I definitely tried not to jump to conclusions and be like, okay, I won't have this. But it was more like, okay, that's an interesting observation. That may not mean anything, but it may. So if I just have a couple of things in place, like having the lactation consultant's number, like having at least a bottle and some formula at home that we could use if we needed to.
Because that's something often overlooked, is, like if you kind of have that intention to breastfeed, buying formula is not going to be something that even crosses your mind, right? Yeah,
totally, especially in New Zealand. I think that, again, it comes back to our heavy emphasis on breast is best. And I now fundamentally disagree with that dogma, just because of how it makes people feel. I think that it's if you can breastfeed your baby, that is awesome, and that's a great milk supply for them, but cost-effective way, and it can be really convenient, but also for a lot of people it does not work for them. And actually, at the end of the day, fed is best. Fed is best. And so, but I also understand, to give people a bit of an understanding about why this has occurred in many other cultures around the world, in countries. This is not the case. I know Ireland, it's actually been quite hard for people to get recognised as that it's okay to breastfeed in public, very conservative, actually a lot of formula feeding there. In the US, there's a lot more formula feeding just because of the low maternity leave. And so New Zealand is often celebrated for our high breastfeeding rates, but I think that this also comes at a cost in terms of a mother's mental well-being, and which, isn't just about having low supply, but
and feeling supported in their whatever they're going through and their choice. Yeah,
totally. Because in New Zealand, it's to the point where a midwife or an antenatal specialist can't even suggest a brand of formula. They just it's all the same, just go. And we are lucky, we do have quite tight regulations on that, so that is the case. But to a point where, even if you get some formula in the hospital, you can't even ask the nurse what formula your baby was fed, because they're we can't recommend brands. And the reason for this is because when formula was first introduced, formula companies did come round to women in maternity hospitals and offer them formula, and then they gave the babies formula, then their breast milk supply dipped because they weren't getting demand, and that is still part of it. And then some of the mothers couldn't afford to keep feeding their baby formula, and therefore we had starving babies, right? And so I understand the public health message. We've moved on. We deserve a bit of nuance. We deserve to understand that, yes, this is a really great way, but also it's not the only way, and you can make that choice.
And sometimes that option isn't even there.
No.
That's the case. That's what's happening here. The option isn't there. You would have loved to have breastfed, I'm sure, exclusively, but the option wasn't there. And that was because of other health things like PCOS.
Yeah. And actually, what it has by having that, what I actually learned was actually that co-feeding with formula and breast milk was the perfect result for me.
Yeah.
Because it also meant that I could, because I worked throughout, right? So I could come to work, and although I was pumping at work, and when Florence was breastfeeding, so she decided that she was, after 3 months, that she was not going to breastfeed anymore, so I pumped exclusively for 7 months after that. But she did also have some formula. But what it meant was that if I was out, or I had forgotten to take the milk that I'd pumped home from the fridge, I didn't have to rush back and get the milk because she was going to starve. She could just have formula.
Yeah.
Or if I was going out, or during the night, Scott could get up and do a feed, and I wouldn't have to be a slave to the pump all day prior to get enough milk to have a freezer stash for him to be able to do that. So actually, I think that it did work out the best thing for me, but it also wasn't necessarily a choice, or I wasn't supported in seeing that was an okay solution either.
Yeah. And as well, when you kind of say Flossie kind of rejected the breast at 3 months, I remember you saying that was because she just couldn't get the milk quick enough. The supply was just too low. So that's another thing as well, is they'll stop latching if the supply is lower. Yeah. If she was smart enough to work out, I get it quicker out of the bottle.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why they often say don't introduce the bottle too early, and there's lots of different things, but at the end of the day, it's
that supply wasn't changing, right? Yeah. So we had to, Flossie needed feeding. Yeah.
We, as I said, I pumped on the hour every hour for a week, which was hugely taxing. Waking up in the night, it's insane. I would never ever do that again. I don't care how much.
Yeah. That's like a torture, right?
It
Waking
was.
up every hour.
Yeah, it was torture. I mean, I did it for the first couple of days, and then I was like, no, like I'm not doing that. And through the night, I would do it every like 3 or 4 hours.
Deprivation.
Oh yeah, it was awful. And then did all of the nutrient stuff, even medication, and so I was on the highest dose of domperidone, the drug, and still like I wasn't getting more than a third of her needs. So that's when it was like, okay, we're going to need to she'll drink what she can, and then we'll top up with the rest, and that worked really well for us. But still, I think in the back of your mind always, and this is what I found when interviewing a lot of our previous patients about this topic, is that they still feel like some sort of sense of failure or guilt around that. Like, if I just tried this, or maybe if this happened. And I do feel that too. It's so strange how pervasive that message has been. That
I think it's just because as well there's so much conversation and chatter around, eczema or asthma or all these things, that if you're not breastfed, you increase your risk of those. You've just had this constant like, something could crop up, or I could have done better, or what. Like, but you had, I saw you had exhausted everything. Like, you had tried everything, so there was nothing more to do, and nothing more that we know about to do.
The other thing was that when I started looking into this, when I was confronted with this, I was like, okay, do we go down the path of getting maybe like donated breast milk? Is that, is formula really that bad? And I started looking into the research, because we're often told exactly those things about breast milk, that babies that are breastfed have higher IQ and less illnesses, less things like asthma, and also lower body weight, like a more normal BMI. So this is what I'd learned all through nutrition school, and that's exactly what I had, then since believed. But when I started looking into the current research, I was actually really surprised, and we won't get into it now because this is a whole nother topic. But when there was one quite large study that I looked into, because a lot of the breastfeeding research is confounded by other variables.
Like the company who makes the formula has funded the study, or things like that.
Or even if we're pushing a breastfeeding agenda, then like again, the breastfeeding stuff is confounded because we know that people that breastfeed generally are higher socioeconomic because they can take the time off work to breastfeed. And so therefore, is that what's actually causing the higher IQ? Same thing that they may live in better housing, and therefore that's why maybe asthma rates might be lower. And so it's not clear cut, like we can just follow a bunch of babies that have been breastfed and then take a group that's been formula fed and then compare their IQ and their body weight and everything else, and then say, well, actually it was the breastfeeding that was the one thing. It's like, okay, but what about everything else, their parents' IQ?
The mum was able to stay away home from work. How much more stimulated was the child in a one-on-one or setting or things like that?
Absolutely. And so that's why so many studies that do seem quite clear cut that these are all, when you actually look deeper, you go, but actually how much of that can we really attribute to that one difference, right? And so the one study that I looked at that I thought this did this really well was a sibling study. And so this was a group of, like, I think it was in the thousands of siblings in the US, and they looked at where one sibling had been breastfed and one had not. So apart from that, we control for all the other factors, like they grew up in the same household, so obviously they had the same
exposure
parents,
to
food, everything. And what they found when they followed these siblings is that there was no difference between the two in terms of IQ, BMI, and like immunity and things. And so that's where we start to question this and be like, okay, is there more to this than what would be led to believe? I still think there is definitely benefit in breastfeeding in terms of the immunoglobulins that we pass on from baby to child, if that's what you want to do. But I no longer think that the only way. It's the only way, or that your baby's getting like a much worse start in life if you don't choose to do that.
And as well, like you've done as well, the co-feeding, it's like you get the best of both worlds, because a lot of these formulas are like super nutrients dense, like they've been really formulated to be like exactly what, you know, a baby needs nutrient wise. So there are, you know, so many incredible nutritional scientists and researchers work on formulas. Like there are teams and teams of people.
Yeah.
Huge money goes into this space, so much research and development. So it's not as if we're just chucking milk powder and something. Like they are some of the most intense supplemented foods on the market.
And regulated.
And regulated, exactly.
Especially in a country like New Zealand. And so, so I think that there is like far more to this story that will come through. And I think that the more that we talk about this and actually have, and I just hope that especially in New Zealand, our antenatal education can provide some nuance or at least conversation around this, because when my antenatal education, our antenatal provider, we had very limited education about what happens once baby's born, but we did have a session on breastfeeding, and she said, only, I think it was like 1% of the population can't breastfeed. And I was like, what about those that have low supply? She's like, that doesn't exist. It's a supply and demand equation. So we can always just increase demand to increase supply.
The calorie equation. Something about the calorie equation.
Exactly. Yeah, and I had pretty much the same response as what I do to when people tell me it's just a calorie equation. I was like, yep, that's part of it. But as I didn't necessarily say anything to her there and then, but I went up to her afterwards and I was like, actually, this is like this, you know, this does affect a lot of people. This is the area that I work in, and I know that this affects a bunch of women, and it's about these breast tissue and hormones. And she was like super responsive. Like, she was amazing. She was like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, thank you. I had no idea, right? And she's worked as an antenatal educator for 20 years.
Yeah, and how many people she will have talked to about this? Yeah,
no idea. And so I think that it's just like, this will just become more and more well known, and hopefully that's why it can create a lot more of a well-rounded conversation that this is, breastfeeding's great, but also if that's not working for you or you choose not to, then formula's also amazing. And then some education about how to formula feed, because that was the other thing, that we got no education. And we were really lucky that we had a fabulous nanny who worked with us, and she'd been a nanny for, like a newborn nanny for 30 years. And so she knew, she was like, okay, well, this is how many meals she'll need, and this is the teat. We would have been totally lost. Yeah. Totally lost if we had not that.
Down to the supermarket and just looked at the shelves and known what to do.
Absolutely. And then being like, like how much does she need and how often? And so we were really lucky that we had that support. But like hardly anybody I know had that support, and therefore would, I hopefully the lactation consultant would have been able to tell us that. But yeah, it's just that, well, where do you go? And that's where you have to try and go online, and who do you listen to, all those sorts of discussions.
And if you're told as well that only like 1% of people experience this or like can't breastfeed, that's exactly where you come back to like, oh my gosh, I feel so much shame, like this is like, I'm so isolated here.
This can't exist, so it must be a me problem.
It's a me problem.
Like exactly. I'm just not trying hard enough. And that's again what you kind of get told. Basically, it's like you're not feeding enough, or your baby's not feeding enough, so you need to take control and do the pumping between feeds. So it was pumping every hour on the hour, as well as feeding.
It's
like a full-time job.
You're a full-time
milkmaid.
So one other red flag that we haven't talked about as well would be breast tissue development during puberty. That can be a bit of a red flag as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the same reason for why it can be a red flag during pregnancy is that, again, if you're not developing that breast tissue during puberty, and again, it doesn't necessarily mean like that small breasts are bad or that big breasts mean that you're going to have no issue. It's about where that placement is. But yeah, that can be definitely a triggering factor. So if you didn't have any or very little breast tissue development during puberty, that could be a red flag. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about like the hormonal profile and why in PCOS particularly we can see that hormone profile not being quite right for milk production.
So when it comes to the hormonal reasons, one of the main ones is those elevated androgens, the quote-unquote male hormones, even though females have a heap of them as well. But these are like testosterone and DHEAS. And so how this works is that if you have higher levels of testosterone, then often what can be happening is that your estrogen is being converted into testosterone because you're actually on the same pathway. And so what this could mean is that actually you have like higher testosterone and lower estrogen. So estrogen and progesterone are actually really important hormones in breast milk production. And so if we've got suppressed estrogen, because actually more of it's been converted into testosterone, or testosterone's inhibiting the production of estrogen, or we also know with PCOS that many women with PCOS have lower progesterone as well, that those two hormones just aren't quite optimal enough in order for that production. So that's one thing, is probably maybe suppressed estrogen and progesterone. The other way is that testosterone can suppress your breastfeeding hormones prolactin and oxytocin. So these are two that are really important, especially for the initial, I think oxytocin is especially important for the initial letdown of milk. So you might hear about this with that breast milk's supply doesn't necessarily come on straight away after birth. It can take a couple of days, and then people talk about the letdown, like finally the body kind of letting that down. And so if you don't have enough of those hormones, then that could potentially affect the letdown phase, and also then just the ongoing milk supply. And that's what there's very, very limited research about this, but that's what the limited research is indicating, that maybe people with PCOS struggle, especially in those really early parts. But maybe if you can get through that, maybe the supply may regulate. And so who knows with me, like if we'd just kind of pushed through and had a screaming, starving baby for 7 days, like would I eventually have had enough milk supply? Who knows? I don't think so, because I was pumping as well, and so trying to emulate her, but I just wasn't really ready to have a baby that had failure to thrive. So I didn't really push it, but it may be that if you can kind of get through that initial phase, once that oxytocin does release, then that might happen. But I definitely did have a much delayed letdown. Like it wasn't until day 10 that I had any kind of letdown. So like much more delayed, where normally you'd see that around about day 3. So yeah, I think that I think our midwife probably did do the best thing in terms of saying, hey, like you need to co-feed, because this is imagine that
have a starving baby.
Having a starving for 10 days would have been hell for her and hell for us.
Yeah.
So I think that's like possibly. So we've got the testosterone, which is we talked about before, inhibiting breast milk supply, but then also maybe creating the like storm where it's just not optimal in terms of for breast milk supply. So that's the testosterone part. Then the second part of having PCOS, another hormone, is our hormone insulin. And we do also know that if you have higher insulin, that can also suppress breast milk supply. And we definitely do see this in not just in PCOS, but also in type 2 diabetes as well. And there's a little bit more research about that.
So do we know how many people are really struggling with their supply? Like what kind of numbers does this look like in PCOS? How prevalent is it?
Again, the research is really slim. I don't think there actually has been a big study. Maybe we could do this. We could survey our Ovies. But our research that we have done, our limited research of people that we've asked, and our patients that we see would indicate about 30% of people that we see do struggle. So it's not the majority by any stretch, but it is a significant amount, right? Like that, if every 10 people we see, 3 of them will struggle, and therefore that's why we need to provide more education around it.
Yeah, totally. And especially if, the testosterone and androgen levels are higher, insulin levels are higher, because maybe that PCOS is less well managed, then that could produce, greater risk too. So it can be really helpful, I guess, as well as for your prenatal period, to try and kind of get those PCOS and those hormones a bit more under control for, say, like a healthier pregnancy, minimizing risk of gestational diabetes and things like that. Also can help really set you up for doing everything we can to try and help bring in breast milk supply too.
Yeah, absolutely. The one hormone I didn't mention before that I should have was also high stress hormones. Now this isn't a PCOS specific thing. You can have high stress hormones and not have PCOS, but also you can have high insulin and not have PCOS. But it's really common to have high stress hormones and have high PCOS. Have high stress hormones and PCOS, and this is what we talk about as one of the drivers of PCOS. And it's also known that cortisol can also just reduce that potential of the breast milk being let down or breast milk supply as well. So if you have got high stress hormones and maybe also high of the androgen, the DHEAS, the adrenal androgen, that could also be
like a bit of a perfect storm.
Yeah, perfect
I
storm
wonder
too.
whether, I haven't looked into it at all, but whether there's any link as well with like postpartum depression and breast milk supply as well, if that's kind of affected in any way because of the stress hormones and the anxiety and being constantly in that kind of fight or flight response.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I mean, there are so many other things that can affect breast milk supply, which can be more temporary. Like, you know, if you do have higher stress hormones and then because you're really worried or you're lacking sleep, then, but that can kind of even out. Or like if you're just not really eating enough.
Oh, totally. Because I mean,
not drinking enough.
Dehydration would be a massive one, completely. And as well, you know, people always say during pregnancy, oh, you know, you're eating for 2 now. It's like, it's actually not so much the case. You're not typically eating for 2, but like in first trimester we might need to eat a little bit more, second trimester a little bit more again, third trimester a little bit more again. The most energy using period of our whole pregnancy is the 4th trimester, which is if we're breastfeeding. It
totally.
Totally. As well, we're like working on sleep deprivation as well. Like your body needs so much more energy there. So very easy for new mums when you're sleep deprived, you don't even have time to make yourself those kinds of like nourishing foods. Very easy to slip into a space of being underfed essentially.
Yeah.
And if you're underfed, how can you feed?
Totally.
Yeah.
Your energy requirements, so say in the 3rd trimester, you only need about, I hate to use numbers, but like 300 calories.
Like a muffin more. Or
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in nutrition school it was kind of, they equated it to like a large glass of milk.
Yeah.
That's what I said.
I think it must have been muffin for me, which is why I remember it. Yeah. It was like you can have this, but like it was almost like 1/3 of a muffin, 2/3 of a muffin, a whole muffin. Yeah.
Oh, that's actually quite a good way. Maybe for us it was like 1/3 of a cup of milk, half a cup of milk, and then there was like a large glass. But then it's like double that in the 4th trimester. It's like 2 glasses of milk, 2 muffins.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that's drinking glasses of milk these days, but if you are, you're sorted.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're so right. It's so much more than what, and given that we struggle to even get the bare basics in, you're probably just not then getting that 2 muffins extra
above and beyond what we would expect to see. You're like probably 3 muffins short.
Yes, exactly.
Let alone the extra.
So if what you normally need to just like live optimally is 5, let's make it easy, 10 muffins a day, then now you need like 13 muffins. But most of the time in like postpartum you don't even have time to eat 7 muffins, right? So like you just like
naturally there's that energy kind of like lack.
Yeah. And the same thing as I said with hydration, that it is, you know, you need so much more water and able to produce, because that's mostly what breast milk is. But I'm thinking that these are things that a normal lactation consultant or someone like a midwife would have already gone through with you. And so this is kind of the not new information. This applies to the general public. The new stuff is, okay, what's specific about me having PCOS that might mean that there's something else going on here, that when they go, well, you know, you're just not trying hard enough, or you need to pump more, you can be like,
rest assured, actually,
this is not a me problem. So so I think that's just really helpful. It was really helpful for me to be aware of this, so that I did have those steps in place. And even though they didn't end up really helping that much, like the domperidone, because if there are some things that do help people, and some the medication, and I think that it did help a bit with supply, but it certainly wasn't like 100% supply. But other people have experienced that. Same thing with some of the supplements. Again, some will see like really great increase from them. Others, it's like, there's a bit extra, but it doesn't, you know, I'm not up to 100% of my baby's needs. It might take me from, I think for me it was, you know, domperidone took me from like 10% to 30%, right? And same thing with some of the other supplements. So it can be helpful, but it might not be the like answer totally. And what are the evidence-based things? Because I think that's you know, when you
there's so many old wives' tales.
So many old wives' tales. Our Ovies as well. We can provide lots of referrals to different people too, so that if you are needing referrals to them, we can help facilitate that. If you're finding value from these podcasts, then we'd be so grateful if you could hit follow on the PCOS Explained podcast. This means that not only you'll get the latest releases, but also that other people are more likely to find this podcast. That's the way the algorithm works. And we all know how important it is to get good information about PCOS. So if you can hit that follow button, it means that people with PCOS that don't know that this podcast exists are more likely to find it. So thank you so much for your help there. Now stand by for our disclaimer. The information contained in this podcast has been prepared for the purpose of providing information, including about the PCOS Nutritionist products and services, and is designed to support clients' overall wellness. It is not intended to provide medical advice or designed to rectify, treat, or cure any specific medical conditions or diseases. Nothing stated or shared in our podcast is intended to be and must not be taken to be medical advice. Please seek the advice of professionals as appropriate regarding the evaluation of any specific information, opinion, advice, or content contained in our podcast.